The session now. Please take a seat. Welcome to the session on values, voices, and participation. And before I let you know how we're going to run the session, I just want to take a few minutes actually to say what we're going to cover in this important session. As we have heard in the previous sessions, there is no one catalog for democratic transition, or it would have been very easy for all of us. In this session, we have to address major issues that would take us to democracy in Egypt, and also we will know about the other countries and the experiences and lessons learned and so on. The first issue, important issue, is about institutions. And we all know that for democracy we need many new institutions, and we also need to reform existing institutions. In Egypt, very quickly, there are new emerging political parties, there are coalitions, commissions, there are reform of professional syndicates, formation of independent workers' unions, and everybody is quickly actually also joining the many and varied structures that have been established every day in Egypt. We want very much that this institution be effective, far away from corruption. We need to reform many institutions, especially police and the security institutions. And we also, and very soon we're going to have a parliament that we're all looking forward that this parliament would be really very effective and would be a very important instrument in building democratic Egypt. We're also going to cover in this session the issue of legislation, and in the transition to democracy we need so many effective, equitable, just legislation that can guarantee, when they are applied, guarantee substantive equality on the ground and guarantee all citizenship rights. We need laws that regulate the electoral system to facilitate the work of political parties, syndicates, NGOs, workers' union, and so many other things. Lastly but not least, when we're talking about democracy, we should remember that democracy is not only politics, but it's a whole way of life. It's a whole set of values that we really need to agree on and apply in our daily life. We need to keep the pluralism, the inclusiveness that we had in our Tahrir Square and elsewhere in Egypt during the revolution, where all the divides have fallen apart. We need to do this. We need to accept the other. We need to have also gender equality, which is very important. So I hope in this session we can cover these three important issues. And I have the privilege of welcoming to the session two very eminent speakers from South Africa and from Mexico. And we also have three discussants with us from Egypt and from Jordan, and hopefully there are other two discussants from Tunisia and also Egypt who would be with us soon. I am introducing the first speaker, Her Excellency Ms. Geraldine Fraser Moleketi, the former Minister of Public Service and Administration in the Republic of South Africa. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, good afternoon and thank you very much. I think it's quite a privilege to be able to join in into this very important dialogue the pathways of democratic transition that you are engaging with, not only as Egypt, but as a number of countries in the Arab states. As was stated repeatedly this morning, and I'd like to endorse this, that ours is not here to come and dictate a particular model or a particular trajectory. The narrative must be written by the peoples of this region. You need to draw and you need to determine your own direction. This afternoon, I'm not going to go into specific depth on the broad areas identified. I'll be looking broadly on some of the questions placed before us, and then I'm going to drill down on the South African experience on constitution making, particularly looking at the transition. Not the detail of constitution making, because we do have Justice Albie Sachs here, who's a constitutional court judge, and not only that, has been involved in the process of negotiation prior to the formal processes in South Africa. So I'm going to touch on some of these issues. What I do want to raise is that there are political choices that are made during transitions to democracy. And there are four sets of choices that can be typically be identified as typical. Firstly, the choice of political institutions that must preside over the shift from conflict to a new order, particularly in situations post-conflict, and the depiction of the situation in this region is one of revolution, much as there's a deep acknowledgement that this is incomplete. And on the choice of political institutions, there's obviously a need on agreement on the first steps that will place a process of transition, put a process of transition in place and mark its progression away from conflict and towards a democratic dispensation. The form of that dispensation is also one that's very clearly determined within a country context. Having said that, I think very clearly one is going to proceed by saying that it's not to dictate in any way what form this will or should take. Secondly, there's the second set of choices, and that concerns the political institutions of a future dispensation. And these are the rules and institutions that will govern the distribution of political power in the state. And I think we know that much of the debate and the contestation is about power and the dispersion of that power, and of course validating the government's ongoing political authority. And we've already heard very graphically this morning how that's being described in this situation. Here, in the instance, here negotiating parties, of course, must make substantive choices about the form of democratic government under the new order, the key public institutions such as the rule of law and human rights, and how public services will be provided. The institutions that result from these choices, and here I'd also want to draw on what has come up from the earlier panels, that much as we may not want to predetermine an outcome, but we know that these institutions will to a large degree embody what the final outcome will look like. And for that reason, these are commonly enshrined in a constitution, as we're all well aware, in law or written agreement, to put a seal on what the new dispensation is. A third set of political choices deals, of course, with economic wealth and resources of the country and how that will be distributed. And again, listening to the voices on the respective panels and hearing what's out there, I think very clearly there's a call that that distribution should be one that would reflect, if I could wish to venture, sort of inclusive, sustainable, and redistributive economic growth. Again, that needs to be determined within a country and context. Social classes or when economic exploitation or inequality underpins a particular conflict and of course human rights violations, then redress for economic injustices is of course a condition for a resolution of the situation in a sustainable way. A fourth set of choices arises, and I presume this will be discussed in more detail, well, in some detail here, but in more detail over the next day as well, is where human rights has been violated in a country in a particular situation. And a country must decide how to address these particular violations. And again, this is something that has been dealt with earlier. So, in short, just to capture that, a transition to democracy is fundamentally a process of political change, and here it's also about making tough choices and being able to deal with that. Now, I just very quickly want to move into the South African situation, and here very quickly talk about some of the debates that we engaged with as we dealt with the transition, and I'm not going to go into the background or the issues that have been dealt with by Mac Maharaj earlier. Now, very quickly, vigorous public debate arose around four crucial questions in the lead up to our, or in the start of the process of our negotiation, its lead up and even post. One, whether interim government was necessary to oversee an election before the drafting of a constitution, whether a new constitution should be drafted by a constituent assembly, whether this constituent assembly should be after an election or before, and whether in our instance in South Africa sanctions should continue, and whether or not group rights had a place in the constitutions. And these debates, I would argue, identified the battle lines in the future talks that preceded. There were three competing scenarios. The regime at that point, the National Party, had not evolved its views beyond what was identified in 1998 by the then Prime Minister P.W. Botha at what was called the Great Indaba, which represented the view that different parties would negotiate a new constitution. The new constitution would then be passed by a white-dominated parliament, essentially, and brought into effect. Now, very clearly, this was rejected, outrightly rejected. One of the smaller liberation movements, the Pan-Africanist Congress, had held a position that a new constitutional dispensation could only be drafted in a constituent assembly, but didn't really develop the substantive areas on the nature of the process that would lead up to the constituent assembly. The views of the African National Congress of South Africa, the largest liberation movement and the oldest one on the African continent, was contained in the Harare Declaration that Mac Maharaj referred to earlier. And in essence, in the Harare Declaration, and this was further developed, the first step that was identified was to remove obstacles towards negotiation. And in this context in South Africa, the very first initiative to this effect was on the 27th of April 1990, where there was a meeting that led to what was called the Grote Skeer Minute, which was the start of this process itself. Mind you, the 27th of April, actually, that was not Grote Skeer. 27th April was when the senior leaders returned from exile, who were involved in negotiations, and that was 4 years to the day when the first democratic elections took place in South Africa. But this was followed by a second step as that determined who exactly would be at the negotiating table. And in this respect, as was pointed out earlier, the ANC preferred the Namibian process where the new constitution would only be drafted after an election. So I'm trying to talk about the institution, the Constituent Assembly itself, and how we got to this. And the view was that this would ensure that there's a constitution that is drafted by the people. It's very much based on the principle of the Freedom Charter, one that talks about inclusivity, ensures legitimacy, and in essence, as the preamble says, that South Africa belongs to all who live in it, and that no government can justly claim authority unless it is based on the will of the people. So it was to ensure that the people participated in the process itself. The third step was to agree on the supervision of the elections itself. And this was to ensure that the government could not be both the referee and player in the same game. And this was something that was seen as quite key, and hence the clear, the setting up of an independent electoral commission for the purpose of the first democratic election and the subsequent elections. And the fourth step would be the establishment of the interim government that enjoyed the confidence of all political groups, an aspect with all political groups. And this was something that was central to much debate. Another aspect, of course, was also the question as to who would direct the South African Broadcasting Corporation. And as was stated, it's a public corporation. It is not the property of the National Party, and I'm quoting, it's a very powerful voice, and we need the confidence in their impartiality. They need to operate with no pressure from either side, close quotes. And this was quite key to the process going forward. In terms of what could either be seen as public pressure or participation, is that the negotiation process itself was supported and tried to ensure that there was a link with popular participation throughout. However, one should say up front that the negotiations itself very much took place behind closed doors. It wasn't completely a public process. It was one where there was feedback from negotiators to their respective constituencies. But there was an attempt to ensure that the process was one that retained the links, and hence at critical points during the negotiations you would have mass formations playing a role to ensure pressure on particular parts of the process. Let me just very quickly again go into some further detail on the Constituent Assembly as one of the institutions that's necessary for the process of ensuring the drafting of a constitution, and I'll bring it to a close in the next 3 minutes around that. In terms of the Constituent Assembly itself, there was a management body that was set up to manage the procedures of the CA. The Constituent Assembly that was formed post the election of the first parliament, which was constituted of the National Assembly and the Senate and beyond, had in it, as I said, this management body. It also set up a panel of constitutional experts that drafted a document on the criteria that would be applied when considering issues for inclusion in the Constitution. This document was tabled at a meeting of the Constitutional Committee. The Constituent Assembly itself functioned from 1994 up to 1996 with the adoption of the Constitution. It also had various thematic committees set up under it and working groups. And in essence, the theme committees were to debate the contesting issue, to deal with issues that came before it. And the difficulty in this committee, and I'd want to just raise this for your consideration, was that the political representatives debating in the theme committees of the Constituent Assembly were often the same people dealing with these matters in the Constitutional Committee. And it's an issue that you need to take into account in going forward. There's also various other issues that one can raise around the Constituent Assembly, but I think maybe I should pause at this point for further discussion and say that there are a number of core institutions that must be set up, as I'd outlined, bearing in mind the challenges of the transition, but these are one of those that are there for the start of the process that you need to grapple with, but taking into account your reality. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this very informative presentation, and I move now to Mexico. And I would like to introduce Mr. Jorge Alcocer, the Secretary of Political Development and Senior Political Advisor of the PRI presidential candidate in 2000. He's going to speak in Spanish, so if anybody needs to have translation. And I ask you please to take attendance.
Nada, agradecer a los organizadores de este evento, de este seminario. Me parece fundamental que hay esta posibilidad de discusión y intercambio de experiencias. Permítanme empezar con una reflexión que me suscita de manera inevitable mi edad y lo que he vivido y lo que está ocurriendo en Egipto, y lo que está ocurriendo en Túnez, y lo que está ocurriendo en esta región del mundo. Para mi generación, para las mujeres y hombres de mi generación, la revolución tenía un significado concreto y un referente histórico. Y más para los mexicanos, como yo. Para los mexicanos la revolución fue la revolución mexicana. Una revolución que se realizó entre 1910 y 1917 y que le costó a nuestro país, a mi país, 1 millón de pesos. Eso fue la revolución de la que surgió un nuevo Estado, un nuevo gobierno y una larga época a la que me he de referir en adelante. Pero después para nosotros la revolución era la revolución rusa. Era 1917, era Lenin, eran los bolcheviques. O la revolución era China, y era Mao Zedong y el Partido Comunista Chino. Y después fue Cuba. Y fue Fidel Castro. ¿Qué es hoy la revolución? ¿De qué estamos hablando en el siglo XXI? Ante esta nueva realidad que nos muestra el caso de Egipto, cuando hablamos de revolución. Y me atrevo a sostener que estamos hablando de un nuevo tipo de revolución y que vamos a tener que reconceptualizar, buscar nuevos conceptos para esta palabra, porque los jóvenes de Egipto, la sociedad de Egipto, como también en Túnez, nos está mostrando que hay una forma diferente de hacer la revolución en el siglo XXI. Que aquí hay una revolución que viene desde abajo, desde la sociedad, los protagonistas de este cambio inicial en Egipto, no han sido los partidos políticos, no han sido los políticos tradicionales, han sido los jóvenes, las mujeres, los hombres que en demanda de libertad se reunieron, se congregaron, no se propusieron hacer un partido, se propusieron cambiar su situación de inmediato. Y lo han hecho de una manera diferente, lo han hecho en lo fundamental de manera pacífica, y lo han hecho tendiendo los puentes y tendiendo las posibilidades de entendimiento y de diálogo dentro de la propia sociedad, que es plural y que lo va a seguir siendo. Creo que entonces estamos, y con eso me parece que hay toda una veta de trabajo intelectual, de trabajo de investigación, pero también de construcción de soluciones ante fenómenos sociales novedosos, tan novedosos que nos cuesta conceptualizarlos bajo los viejos moldes de la politología, la sociología o lo que sabíamos de los referentes históricos. El gran reto, creo yo, no será darle una conceptualización, una teoría al cambio que ha ocurrido en Egipto. Me parece que en lo inmediato el gran reto es que la sociedad egipcia, sus jóvenes, sus mujeres, sus trabajadores, sus intelectuales, sus profesionistas, sus empresarios puedan construir un camino hacia adelante. Un camino que haga que esta transformación que ya ocurrió, porque aquí ya no hay el viejo gobierno, hay una nueva situación, hay que construir una nueva relación social y una nueva relación política. Y creo que para eso puede servir este intercambio de experiencias, cómo vivió Sudáfrica su proceso de transición, cómo lo vivió Argentina, cómo lo vivió Chile, cómo lo vivieron otras naciones de América Latina o incluso de Europa. Recuerdo, por ejemplo, que en los años 80, finales de los 70, principios de los 80, hablábamos de la revolución de los claveles en Portugal. Ahora a la revolución en Túnez le han denominado, sé que a mucha gente, a muchas personas en Túnez no les gusta esta denominación, pero le han denominado la revolución del jazmín. Y a mí me evocó Portugal, la revolución de los claveles. ¿Y qué tenían en común? Que eran cambios pacíficos, que fueron cambios, insisto, no se me escapa que ha habido lamentablemente represión de pronto, que aquí costó la vida de algunos jóvenes, de algunos ciudadanos, pero en lo fundamental estamos ante un proceso de transformación pacífica que va a requerir tener una trayectoria hacia adelante. Y en eso, déjenme pasar a la siguiente parte, permítanme abordar la referencia a México. Creo que lo que México tiene para estudiar, para analizar, es que nuestra transición a la democracia, la transición a la democracia en México, no provino desde un régimen dictatorial. En México no hubo derrumbe del gobierno para hacer la transición. México había sido gobernado durante más de 65 años, cuando la transición se aceleró, por el mismo partido político, que había sido absolutamente dominante. Al final de cuentas, el Partido Revolucionario Institucional gobernó a México del año 1929 al año 2000.